prose is something most writers are told to avoid, but we aren't always explained why we need to avoid it or how to spot it in our own stories. In this video, I'm hoping to answer both of these questions, as well as provide some examples that compare purple prose to descriptive prose and how one might be more effective than the other. So first, why is purple prose a problem? Some writers argue that purple prose is nothing more than a stylistic choice, especially for writers who write historic fiction or epic fantasy. But I would argue that purple prose is not the same as descriptive or poetic language. Instead, purple prose is convoluted, muddy, and difficult to follow. It often obscures the true meaning of a story by piling on too many distracting metaphors and dense description. Basically, purple prose makes a story less enjoyable and less likely to leave an impression on the reader, while descriptive language, on the other hand, can elevate a standard story into something that is captivating, immersive, and memorable, and that readers come away from feeling like they actually lived through a new experience and carry the story as a distinct memory, rather than a vague story they heard one time. And I think that is the goal for most writers. You want to write something that seeps into your reader's bones and lingers in their memory long after the story is over. Purple prose, in my opinion, will rarely, if ever, help with that endeavor. A writer who is unaware of what specifically makes up purple prose, or how to spot it in their own writing, might think they are adding necessary detail or unique metaphors to their story, when they are actually clogging their words with purple prose and leaving the story less engaging, less original, and less memorable. So, how do you spot purple prose? What does it look like? Well, first of all, purple prose is a hallmark of first drafts, and I don't really recommend trying to find it or fix it until revision. There's no reason to focus on editing at the line level before you've done structural edits, so don't worry about purple prose during your first draft. I never do. Once you are ready to edit your story at a line level, though, here are 4 easy ways to spot purple prose in your story. First, abstract words instead of concrete words. I've done some videos about this before, but basically, when you are writing, you want to use words that a person can interact with tangibly by using their 5 senses. Words that you can see, touch, taste, smell, or hear. Those are concrete words. You want to stay away from intangible words, like concepts or emotions. Words like happiness, kindness, instability, freedom. Those are abstract words, and are a hallmark of purple prose, and telling rather than showing. There is nothing for the reader to interact with or hold on to in those words. They are muddy, obscure, intangible words and will never leave a lasting impact on your reader. You can't create a memory by relying on words the reader can't interact with. And when writing, I think a common way to tell if your story is quote-unquote good is to see how memorable people find it. Meaning, you want to create memories in your reader, not simply ply them with pretty words. Let's look at an example. This summer is nostalgic and filled with memories from happier times. Versus, this summer explodes on your tongue, tasting of chewed blades of long grass, your own clean sweat, Marie biscuits with butter squirting through the holes, and shaken bottles of red lemonade picnicked in tree houses. Which sentence creates a more vivid image in your mind? Which one is more active and engaging? Which one feels more original? Which one feels more generic? Which one has a stronger voice? Which makes you want to read the rest of the story? It's likely that a lot of you found the second sentence more engaging and memorable. But isn't that interesting because the first sentence is so much shorter, which might seem like a writer who is avoiding overly long, flowery purple prose. But this is a good example of purple versus descriptive prose. In this example, the first sentence uses all abstract words that are intangible concepts or emotions. There is nothing in that sentence that the reader can interact with using any of the 5 senses. While the second sentence only uses concrete, identifiable words the reader can really hold on to and interact with in their mind. It points you to an image, and that image creates a feeling of nostalgia and happiness without ever having to say the words nostalgia or happiness. It is showing versus telling. The first sentence is also passive. It uses only the to-be verb is, compared to the second sentence, which uses several active verbs, explodes, tasting, squirting, and never once uses a passive to-be verb. So the first sentence is one that I just made up, but the second sentence is from the first page of Tana French's literary mystery novel, In the Woods. She's a writer who is known for evocative, voicey prose that has the ability to really capture the reader in the story's world, and not let go until the very end. Let's look at another example. This one is from Rainbow Rowell's Fangirl. Are you the older or younger twin? She shrugged. It was a C-section, but Ren was bigger. She was stealing my juice or something. I had to stay in the hospital for 3 weeks after she went home. Kat didn't tell him that sometimes she felt like Ren was still taking more than her fair share of life, like she was siphoning vitality off Kat, or like she was born with a bigger supply. In this example, we do get an abstract word, vitality, but because the description immediately follows the vivid imagery of one twin stealing from another in the womb, we are grounded in something concrete for us to see and interact with. If this description just popped up by itself, it wouldn't have nearly as big of an impact as it does now. Imagine all we got was the second part of the section that says, Kath didn't tell him that sometimes she felt like Ren was still taking more than her fair share of life, like she was siphoning vitality off Kath, or like she was born with a bigger supply. By itself, that sentence is fairly weak. Not only does it use abstract language, but it also relies on telling the reader how Kath feels. Only reason this works is because it's paired with the vivid imagery from directly before. Combined with that imagery, this apparently weak sentence becomes a necessary moment for the prose to linger on these emotions, highlighting this moment for the reader and slowing the pace so we have time to process the description that we just read. If every image in the book was followed by an abstract explanation, then we would likely become very bored. This type of follow-up sentence is only used to slow the pacing so certain moments can linger. It should be used extremely rarely and with conscious purpose. I hope that helps you identify when abstract or passive language can be useful in controlling the pacing and focus of your prose. So the second way to identify purple prose is an abundance of adjectives and adverbs. Most writers know to steer clear of adverbs, since they usually mean a writer has chosen the wrong verb, or as Stephen King once said, the road to hell is paved with adverbs. But it's easy for writers to mistake an adjective-filled sentence with good descriptive writing, when in reality, using too many adjectives only highlights the description's lack of concrete details and actually makes it harder for readers to picture the scene in their head, rather than easier. Which is what you might assume would be the case when you add multiple adjectives to a description. It might help to think that using adjectives means you are using the wrong noun. Obviously, this isn't a cut and dry rule that says you should cut all adjectives from your writing, but listing adjectives and adverbs almost always weakens a description rather than strengthening it. Think of it this way. An old red wooden door is much harder to imagine than a door that creaks on its hinges and looks to be doused in pig's blood. Which brings me to the next way to identify purple prose, and that is unnecessary or unrelated metaphors and similes. Now, I used a simile in the previous description. The paint on the door looks like pig's blood, but that matches the tone of the door that creaks on its hinges, and I was picturing a spooky scene. You never would have known that if I'd stuck with the first listicle description of an old red wooden door. But while metaphors and similes often add life and voice to prose, they can easily get out of hand and bog down a story by muddying up the reader's mind until none of the sentences stick out, and they're just reading words that go in one ear and out the other. This often contributes to the idea that purple prose appears pretentious to readers, because it feels like the writer is showing off rather than telling a story. Readers can feel outcasted or put off when they feel like the writer is just throwing in unrecognizable words or far-flung contrived metaphors in order to make their writing feel smart. For a good rule of thumb, try sticking to one metaphor per important description. So, if you're describing a kitchen, you can use a metaphor to describe the most important part of the room, the part that will have the most impact or scene time in the story. But no other place in the description can use a metaphor. Maybe you allow one metaphor to describe the stove, but nowhere else, because the stove is the place in the kitchen that will have the most meaning later on in the story. Using metaphors this way can be a good way to subtly direct readers' attention to certain aspects of the scene that are the most important, or that will come to be important later on in the story. Finally, a good way to spot purple prose is by examining your sentence length. Ideally, you want to aim for varied, rhythmic sentence structures that elevate your prose from simple paragraphs to something with its own innate musicality and voice. Long, multi-segmented sentences should be used sparingly. This isn't the 1800s after all. What worked for Tolkien will rarely work for a modern audience reading today's fiction. We want variety. Short, punchy sentences followed by longer sentences during moments of the story that need more breathing room. The length and structure of your sentences really contributes to your story's overall pacing. You want to make sure that you aren't slowing down your action with overly long sentences packed full of commas, semicolons, and parentheses, because that is a hallmark of purple prose. Also, I do offer fiction editing on Fiverr, anything from short stories or single chapters to whole novels. If anybody has a story out there that they'd like for me to look at, please check out the link in the description box below. Thank you. Please like and subscribe.